Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to talk about the useReducer hook. Now, we're not actually going to bring this hook into our live application because, as you can tell from the name useReducer, it's something that has to do with Redux or a similar reducer-like pattern that we've already gotten familiar with when it comes to Redux. useReducer lets us actually build out reducer functions and leverage them as state management inside of our components the same way that useState does. Except it's going to follow a similar flow of data of firing actions and then those actions changing a reducer object of some kind, the way that we've seen with Redux, except localized to a component. Now, this useReducer hook is really great in places where you need more complex local state management. And a great place to see this is actually our useEffect example. So this example here that I've got is pretty much just our useEffect example, except the name is modified to useReducer. And in this lesson, we are going to switch this component's use of useState over to the new useReducer hook. What we need to do is import useReducer from React. And the useReducer hook, you'll notice when we write out this code, is going to resemble very closely to the Redux code that we're already used to writing. The only difference is that we have to use some of the React hook style of writing out this code. So what we'll do is we will first understand what it is that useReducer gives us back. And it's very similar to our useState hook. We're going to declare a const where we get back and destructure off the array values from the array we get back from useReducer. And the two things we're going to destructure off is the state as the first thing, which means that this is the current state of our reducer, as well as dispatch. Dispatch being the literal function that we get that allows us to pass actions to our reducer. Then in order for us to instantiate this reducer, we pass it two things. The first thing we pass it is the reducer itself. The reducer being the function that gets both a state and an action, and then using a switch statement returns us back some object that represents our state. This is pretty much every reducer that we've ever written in Redux. It's the exact same thing. And then the second argument being the actual initial state value. So if you're familiar with Redux and reducers, we just have to pass initial state into our useReducer call instead of setting it as the default state value when we write our reducer function. But let's actually see this. So the first thing we're going to do is initialize our initial state. And we're going to set it equal to some object that is equal to our user being null and our search query being Brett. So what we've done here is we've pretty much done the exact same initial state for our useState hooks. So now we can remove these and continue writing our reducer. Now the reducer itself is some function that gets the state and the action as the parameters. And what we're going to do is write a switch statement checking the action.type. And then based on the case of what we get back, we're going to do and return different objects. Pretty much just like every reducer we've written. So here we're going to say if it's setUser, we're going to return a new object where we spread in the state, as we're always used to doing, and then setting user equal to action.payload. So there's nothing new here. In fact, case is going to do the same thing. We're just going to say set search query is equal to the return of the object where we spread in state and update search query with action.payload. Finally, as we always know, with the default return case, we just want to return state. So this reducer is pretty much the exact same reducer that you're used to writing. We also need to create our action creators. So our setUser is going to take a user object and return us back an object where type goes to setUser, and the payload is the user. Similarly, set search query will be pretty much the exact same type of function where we get some query string, and we return back an object where type is set search query, and the payload is the query string. So nothing new. Everything here is pretty much the exact same thing that you're used to seeing whenever we implemented our original Redux reducers. Now, the only difference is how we end up using this. So here, what we want to do is we want to pull off the values from our state that we want to use. So we're just going to destructure off the user and the search query from our state object. Next, what we need to do is actually dispatch the appropriate actions. And because before we've named our actions the same as what we had it inside of our old use effect example, this set user and this set search query is literally just using our action creator functions that we just wrote now. So we're passing in the object that we get back, and we are creating this new action. So we just want to dispatch this action that we're creating from this function call into our reducer. So we simply just wrap that inside of our dispatch. And just like that, it's going to work exactly the same way as we had it before. The only difference is now we're using this reducer. And as you might have noticed, it looks pretty much the exact same as the reducer code we're used to writing with Redux. So if we go back to our application, now we see that when I type in Samantha, it behaves the same way as it was before when we were using state, except we've managed to move every code into a use reducer hook. So this is pretty much all the use reducer hook is. It's a native React way of implementing Redux, and sometimes it's actually very useful to use this when you need something a little bit more minuscule than a full Redux implementation inside of your application, but you think you need something more complex than simply just using use state. This is a great time to use reducer because you have access to the state object inside of your reducer so that you can modify your state values however you want, as you typically would with Redux. So you get all of the Redux functionality, of course minus the asynchronous event handling, except you can do it now with conjunction of your use effect hooks, your use state hooks if you also want, but generally speaking, you only want to use a use reducer or use state separately. But with this, you'll notice that now the code looks way closer to what we wrote with our Redux implementation. So this is actually the direction that React wants to move as well. It values the Redux library and its flow and the benefits that it brings, but it's trying to abstract away some of that complexity by allowing you to write this use reducer hook inside of your component so you don't have to break up all these files and make all these action creators. But again, there's pros and cons of both. So hopefully with this, you understand the use reducer hook, and now you're pretty well equipped to understand and use hooks inside of applications or projects that you join or start yourself.